The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the courthouse, but Maria felt only darkness around her. She sat on the hard wooden bench in the hallway, wearing a simple black dress instead of her usual expensive business suits. Her hands shook as she tried to read the legal papers one more time, but the words seemed to dance on the page. Just 6 months ago, Maria had been on the cover of Business Weekly magazine. The headline called her the tech princess who built an empire. At 28 years old, she owned a technology company worth $3 billion. She had started the company from her garage when she was just 22, working day and night to build something that would help people connect better through technology. Now everything was gone. The trouble started when Maria noticed something wrong with the company's money. Numbers did not match. Money was missing from accounts that should have been full. When she asked questions, the board members told her not to worry. They said it was just accounting mistakes. But Maria was smart with numbers. She had built her whole company by understanding every detail of how money moved. She decided to investigate on her own. Late at night in her office, she would check computer records and bank statements. What she found made her sick to her stomach. Several board members were stealing millions of dollars from the company. They were moving money to fake accounts and then taking it for themselves. Maria knew she had to report this crime to the police. But before she could act, something terrible happened. The board members discovered she was investigating them. They moved fast to protect themselves. One morning, Maria woke up to find FBI agents at her door. They had a warrant for her arrest. The charges were shocking: fraud, money laundering, and theft of company funds. The same crimes she was about to report were now being blamed on her. The board members had been clever. They planted evidence that made it look like Maria was the one stealing money. They claimed she had been taking money for years and was now trying to cover it up. Since she was the CEO, she had access to all accounts, which made their lies seem believable. The news spread like fire. Every television channel and newspaper ran stories about the fallen tech princess who had stolen from her own company. Her picture was everywhere, but now people looked at her with disgust instead of admiration. Her friends disappeared first. People she had known for years stopped taking her phone calls. Business partners canceled meetings. Even her own employees looked at her differently when she walked through the office for the last time. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as CEO. They froze her bank accounts and took away her access to company buildings. In one day, Maria went from being one of the richest people in the country to having almost nothing. Ben Rodriguez had been cleaning the courthouse for 15 years. Every morning at 6 o'clock, he would arrive with his cart full of cleaning supplies. He would mop the floors, empty the trash cans, and clean the windows until they sparkled. People barely noticed him as he worked, but Ben noticed everything. Ben was 53 years old and had raised his daughter Rosa as a single father after his wife died in a car accident. Rosa had been his whole world, a bright girl who wanted to be a lawyer someday. She would often come to the courthouse after school and do her homework while Ben finished his work. She would sit in the empty courtrooms and pretend to be a lawyer defending innocent people. Tragedy struck when Rosa was 17. She was walking home from her job at a local store when a drunk driver hit her. The driver was the son of a wealthy family in town. His father hired expensive lawyers who found ways to reduce the charges. Rosa died, but the young man spent only 6 months in jail. Ben learned a hard lesson about justice that day. He saw how money could buy different treatment in the legal system. Poor families like his had to accept whatever justice they were given, while rich families could hire their way out of trouble. After Rosa's death, Ben threw himself into learning about the law. He spent his lunch breaks in the courthouse library, reading legal books and court cases. He listened to trials when he could, learning how lawyers presented evidence and how judges made decisions. He studied because he wanted to understand the system that had failed his daughter. Now, 15 years later, Ben knew more about law than many people with college degrees. He could spot weak arguments and unfair procedures. But he was still just a janitor, and nobody asked for his opinion about anything. On this particular morning, Ben noticed Maria as soon as she walked into the courthouse. He had seen her picture in the newspapers and on television. Everyone in the city knew about her case. Some people said she was guilty and deserved punishment. Others believed the charges were unfair. Ben watched Maria sit alone on the bench. She looked very different from the confident woman he had seen in news interviews. Her eyes were red from crying, and she kept checking her phone as if waiting for important news. She wore no jewelry and carried a simple bag instead of the expensive purses he had seen her with in magazine photos. As the morning passed, Ben noticed how other people in the courthouse treated Maria. Lawyers walked past her without making eye contact. Court workers whispered and pointed at her from across the room. Even the security guards watched her more closely than usual, as if she might try to run away. Ben felt sorry for her. He remembered how alone he had felt during Rosa's case, sitting in these same hallways while expensive lawyers worked against his family. He could see that same loneliness in Maria's face. At 10 o'clock, Maria's phone rang. Ben was close enough to hear her side of the conversation. Her voice was hopeful at first, then confused, then desperate. "What do you mean you cannot represent me anymore?" Maria asked into the phone. Her voice got louder, drawing stares from people nearby. "But the trial starts in 1 hour. You cannot just leave me now." She listened for a moment, then her face went pale. "Your law firm is worried about its reputation. What about my life? What about the truth?" The conversation ended quickly. Maria stared at her phone for a long moment, then put her head in her hands and began to cry quietly. Ben had heard enough to understand what happened. Maria's lawyers had abandoned her right before the trial. This was the worst thing that could happen to someone facing criminal charges. Without a lawyer, she would have to defend herself against trained prosecutors who had spent months preparing their case. Ben continued his work, but he kept watching Maria from the corner of his eye. She made several more phone calls, trying to find a new lawyer. Each conversation went the same way. No law firm wanted to take her case on such short notice, especially when it involved such serious charges and so much negative publicity. By 11 o'clock, Maria was completely alone. She sat on the bench holding her legal papers, but Ben could see she did not really understand them. The documents were full of legal language that was confusing even to people who studied law for years. Case number 2024, CR 15847, State vs. Maria Santos, called the court clerk from the doorway. "The court is ready to begin." Maria stood up slowly. Her legs seemed unsteady, and she had to hold on to the wall for support. She looked around the hallway one last time, as if hoping her lawyer might still arrive to save her. Ben watched her walk toward the courtroom door. He had seen many people make that walk over the years. Some walked with confidence, surrounded by expensive legal teams. Others walked with fear, but at least they had lawyers beside them. Maria walked alone. Ben pushed his cleaning cart to a position where he could see through the courtroom window. Inside, he watched Maria take her seat at the defendant's table. The prosecutor's table was full of lawyers and assistants, all with thick folders of evidence. Maria's table looked empty and sad with just her sitting there by herself. Judge Wilson entered the courtroom, and everyone stood. Ben knew Judge Wilson was fair but strict. He did not tolerate delays or excuses. "Please be seated," Judge Wilson said. "We are here for the case of State vs. Maria Santos. Is the defendant ready to proceed?" Maria stood up. Her voice was so quiet that people in the back of the courtroom could not hear her. "Your Honor, my lawyer is not here today." "Where is your legal representation, Ms. Santos?" "They cannot represent me anymore, Your Honor. They withdrew from the case this morning." Judge Wilson looked surprised and annoyed. "This trial has been scheduled for months. Why are you just now without counsel?" Maria tried to explain, but her voice kept breaking. Ben could see she was fighting back tears. The judge's expression was not sympathetic. He had dealt with many cases and did not have patience for last-minute problems. Ms. Santos, you are facing serious federal charges. You cannot proceed without proper legal representation. I am inclined to postpone this trial until you can find new counsel. The prosecutor stood up immediately. Your Honor, the state objects to any delay. The defendant has had months to secure representation. A postponement would be unfair to the victims of her alleged crimes. Ben knew what this meant. If the trial was postponed, Maria would have to stay in jail until the new trial date because she could not afford bail. She might spend months in prison before she even had a chance to defend herself. As Ben watched through the window, he saw Maria's shoulders begin to shake. She was losing the battle against her tears. This was the moment when her life would either be saved or destroyed, and she was facing it completely alone. Something deep inside Ben's heart began to stir. He thought about his daughter Rosa and how he had wished someone with courage would have stood up for her when she needed help. He thought about all the years he had spent learning about law and justice while cleaning these floors. Ben looked at his cleaning cart, then back at Maria standing alone in the courtroom. For 15 years, he had been invisible in this place, just a janitor that people did not notice. But sometimes being invisible meant you could see things that others missed. And what Ben could see was that this young woman needed someone to fight for her, just like his Rosa had needed someone to fight for her all those years ago. The time for watching was over. Ben stood outside the courtroom window, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Inside, he could see Maria's hands shaking as she tried to speak to Judge Wilson. The prosecutor was shuffling through papers with a satisfied look on his face, knowing that without a lawyer, Maria had almost no chance of defending herself. Your Honor, Maria said in a voice so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear her, I understand the court's concern, but I cannot afford to wait. I have already been in jail for 2 weeks because I cannot pay bail. If you postpone the trial, I might be in jail for months more while I try to find a lawyer who will take my case. Judge Wilson looked at the papers in front of him. Ben could see the judge was struggling with a difficult decision. The law said everyone deserved proper legal representation, but it also said that cases should move forward without unnecessary delays. Ms. Santos, I sympathize with your situation, but I cannot allow you to represent yourself in such a serious case. Federal fraud charges require expert legal knowledge. Without proper counsel, you will almost certainly be found guilty. The prosecutor stood up again. Your Honor, if I may remind the court, the defendant had millions of dollars at her disposal when these crimes were committed. She chose to spend that money on personal luxuries instead of securing proper legal representation. The state should not be penalized for the defendant's poor planning. Ben felt anger rise in his chest. He knew from his research that the board members had frozen all of Maria's accounts. She had no access to her money, which meant she could not hire expensive lawyers like the prosecutor was suggesting. But nobody in the courtroom seemed to know this important fact. Maria tried to explain. Your Honor, my accounts have been frozen. I do not have access to any money. The lawyers I hired initially were paid with company funds, but when the board removed me as CEO, those payments stopped. I have been trying to find a lawyer who will work for free, but nobody will take such a complicated case without payment. Judge Wilson sighed heavily. Ben had seen this expression on the judge's face many times over the years. It was the look of a man who wanted to do the right thing but was trapped by legal procedures and time pressures. Ms. Santos, I am going to give you one more chance. Is there anyone in this courtroom who can speak for you? A friend, family member, or legal advisor who might assist you until proper counsel can be arranged? Maria looked around the courtroom desperately. Ben could see her scanning the faces of the people in the gallery, hoping someone might volunteer to help her. But the few people present were either court workers, reporters, or curious citizens. Nobody moved to help her. No, Your Honor, Maria said finally. I have no one. That was the moment when something broke open inside Ben's chest. All the pain he had carried for 15 years since Rosa's death, all the anger about injustice he had witnessed in this courthouse, all the knowledge he had gained from years of studying law in his spare time, everything came together in one clear thought: he could not let this happen. Ben looked down at his janitor's uniform, covered with cleaning chemicals and worn thin from years of use. He thought about how people saw him every day but never really noticed him. He was just the man who cleaned up after everyone else, invisible and unimportant. But Rosa had taught him that being important was not about what job you had or how much money you made. It was about standing up for what was right when nobody else would. Ben opened the courtroom door and stepped inside. The sound of the heavy door closing made everyone turn to look. Ben felt dozens of eyes on him as he walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, his work boots making soft sounds on the carpet. He could hear people whispering, wondering why the janitor was interrupting the trial. "Excuse me," Ben said in a clear voice that surprised even himself. "Your Honor, I would like to speak for the defendant." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Wilson looked confused and slightly annoyed. The prosecutor jumped to his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Who is this man? He cannot simply walk into a courtroom and volunteer to provide legal counsel." Ben stopped in front of the judge's bench and looked up at Judge Wilson. "Your Honor, my name is Ben Rodriguez. I have worked in this courthouse for 15 years. During that time, I have studied law extensively and have observed hundreds of trials. I believe I can assist Ms. Santos in presenting her defense." Judge Wilson stared at Ben for a long moment. "Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your willingness to help, but providing legal counsel requires a law degree and passing the bar examination. You cannot simply volunteer to be someone's lawyer." "I understand that, Your Honor," Ben replied calmly. "But according to the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution, every defendant has the right to legal counsel. If proper counsel is not available, the defendant has the right to represent herself or to choose someone to assist her in that representation. I am not claiming to be a lawyer. I am offering to assist Ms. Santos as her legal advisor and spokesperson." The prosecutor was getting angry. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot allow a janitor to provide legal advice in a federal criminal trial. This man has no qualifications whatsoever." Ben turned to face the prosecutor. "Sir, with respect, my qualifications include 15 years of studying federal criminal law, constitutional law, and court procedures. I have read more than 3,000 court cases and have observed more than 500 trials in this courthouse. While I do not have a law degree, I have more practical knowledge of criminal procedure than many lawyers who passed the bar examination but rarely practice criminal law." Judge Wilson was clearly struggling with this unusual situation. Ben could see the judge looking through legal books on his desk, trying to find precedent for what was happening. Maria stood up slowly. "Your Honor, if Mr. Rodriguez is willing to help me, I would like to accept his assistance. I know him by sight from seeing him work in this courthouse, and I believe he is sincere in his offer to help." Ben felt surprised that Maria knew who he was, but he was grateful for her support. He looked at her face and saw something that had not been there before: hope. Judge Wilson made his decision. "Against my better judgment, and only because of the unusual circumstances of this case, I will allow Mr. Rodriguez to assist the defendant in presenting her case. However, I want to make it clear that Mr. Rodriguez is not acting as an attorney. He is simply helping Ms. Santos represent herself. All final decisions about the defense strategy must come from Ms. Santos herself." The prosecutor was furious. "Your Honor, I object in the strongest possible terms. This sets a dangerous precedent that anyone can walk into a courtroom and provide legal advice." "Your objection is noted," Judge Wilson said firmly. "But the defendant's right to representation takes precedence. We will proceed with Mr. Rodriguez assisting the defense. However, I will not tolerate any delays or mistakes that result from inexperience. This trial will move forward efficiently." Ben walked over to the defense table and sat down next to Maria. Up close, he could see how frightened she was, but also how grateful. She whispered, "Thank you," so quietly that only he could hear it. "Ms. Santos," Ben said softly, "I need you to tell me everything about your case. Not the legal details, but the truth about what happened. I have read the charges against you in the newspapers, but I want to hear your version of events." While the prosecutor and judge discussed procedural matters, Maria quickly told Ben her story. She explained how she had discovered money missing from company accounts, how she had investigated on her own, and how the board members had turned the tables on her before she could report their crimes. Ben listened carefully, asking questions that surprised Maria with their insight. "Did you keep copies of the evidence you found?" he asked. "Did you document your investigation in any way? Did anyone else know what you were doing?" "I kept everything on a personal laptop at home," Maria said. "I was building a complete case before I went to the authorities. But when I was arrested, the FBI took all my computers and files. My lawyer said they were part of the evidence against me now." Ben nodded thoughtfully. He had an idea, but he needed to be careful about how to proceed. "Maria, I need you to trust me. I am going to ask you some questions during this trial that might seem strange or even harmful to your case. But everything I do will be aimed at getting to the truth. Can you trust me to do that?" Maria looked into Ben's eyes and saw something that reminded her of her father, who had died when she was young. There was kindness there, but also strength and determination. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." The trial began in earnest. The prosecutor presented his opening statement, painting Maria as a greedy young woman who had stolen millions from her own company to fund an expensive lifestyle. He showed pictures of Maria's expensive car, her large house, and her designer clothes as evidence of her spending habits. When it was Ben's turn to make an opening statement, he stood up slowly. He was not used to speaking in front of so many people, but he thought about Rosa and found his courage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ben began, "you are going to hear a story about greed and theft. But the real criminals are not sitting at this table. Maria Santos is not a thief. She is a victim of a conspiracy by people who were supposed to protect her company and its shareholders." Ben's voice grew stronger as he continued. "The prosecutor wants you to believe that Ms. Santos stole money to buy expensive things. But I want you to ask yourselves, if someone was stealing millions of dollars, would they leave such obvious evidence? Would they use company accounts that could be easily traced? Or would they find smarter ways to hide their crimes?" The prosecutor objected. "Your Honor, the defense is speculating about evidence that has not been presented." Sustained, Judge Wilson said. "Mr. Rodriguez, please limit your opening statement to what you intend to prove with evidence." Ben nodded. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will show you evidence that Ms. Santos was investigating financial irregularities in her company when she was framed for crimes she did not commit. We will prove that the Real thieves used their positions of trust to steal money and then blamed their victim when she got too close to discovering their scheme." As Ben sat down, he felt Maria squeeze his hand under the table. For the first time in months, she felt like someone was fighting for her instead of against her. The real battle was just beginning, but Ben had given Maria something precious, hope that the truth might finally come out. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to watch the unusual trial. News reporters filled the back rows, taking notes about the janitor who was defending a billionaire. Ben could feel their eyes on him as the prosecutor began presenting evidence against Maria. For 3 days, the prosecutor showed the jury bank records, financial statements, and computer files that seemed to prove Maria had stolen money from her company. The evidence looked strong, and Ben could see some jury members nodding as the prosecutor explained each piece of evidence. But Ben had been studying these documents carefully during every break in the trial. His 15 years of reading legal cases had taught him to look for details that others might miss. And he was beginning to see a pattern that the prosecutor had either overlooked or chosen to ignore. When it was time for the defense to present their case, Ben stood up with confidence he had never felt before. "Your Honor, I would like to call Maria Santos to the witness stand." Maria looked nervous as she walked to the witness chair. She had been quiet during the prosecutor's presentation, watching Ben take notes and whisper questions to her. Now it was time for her to tell her story. "Maria," Ben began gently, "please tell the jury about your company and how you started it." Maria's voice was shaky at first, but as she talked about her dream of creating technology that would help people, her confidence grew. She explained how she had worked 18-hour days in her garage, learning computer programming and business management by herself. "When your company became successful, how closely did you monitor the financial accounts?" Ben asked. "Very closely," Maria replied. "I reviewed every major expense and checked the bank balances every week. I wanted to make sure we were spending money wisely and not wasting the investments people had made in our company." Ben nodded. "So you would have noticed if large amounts of money were missing?" "Yes, absolutely. I knew where every dollar was supposed to be." The prosecutor objected. "Your Honor, the defendant is just trying to make herself look responsible. Her actions prove otherwise." Overruled, Judge Wilson said. "The jury can decide what to believe." Ben continued his questioning. "Maria, when did you first notice something was wrong with the company's finances?" "About 8 months ago," Maria answered. "I was reviewing our quarterly reports and noticed that our cash reserves were lower than they should have been. When I asked our chief financial officer about it, he said there had been some accounting adjustments that he would explain later. But he never did explain." "What did you do next?" "I started checking the accounts myself at night after everyone had gone home. That was when I discovered that money was being moved to accounts I had never seen before." Ben walked over to the evidence table and picked up a folder. "Your Honor, I would like to present Defense Exhibit A, which contains copies of emails that were found on Ms. Santos's personal laptop." The prosecutor stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Those emails were not included in the original evidence list." Ben had expected this objection. "Your Honor, these emails were on the personal laptop that the FBI seized from Ms. Santos's home. They were included in the evidence collected by the prosecution, but they were not presented during the prosecution's case. I believe the jury has a right to see all the evidence, not just the pieces that support one side." Judge Wilson examined the folder. "I will allow these emails to be entered as evidence, but I want to review them first to make sure they are relevant to this case." After a few minutes, the judge handed the folder back to Ben. "You may proceed, Mr. Rodriguez." Ben handed copies of the emails to the jury members. "Ladies and gentlemen, these emails show that Ms. Santos was not stealing money from her company. She was investigating who was stealing money from her company. The emails were messages between Maria and a computer security expert she had hired privately. They showed that Maria was trying to trace where missing money had gone and who had authorized the transfers." "Maria," Ben continued, "why did you hire a security expert instead of reporting your suspicions to the police immediately?" "Because I wanted to be absolutely sure before I made such serious accusations," Maria replied. "The people I suspected were board members who had helped build the company. I respected them and thought there might be an innocent explanation. I wanted to have complete proof before I destroyed anyone's reputation." Ben could see that several jury members were listening more carefully now. The emails painted a very different picture than the one the prosecutor had presented. "What happened when you got closer to discovering the truth?" Maria's voice became quieter. "I found out who was stealing the money and how they were doing it. I was planning to meet with FBI agents the next week to report the crimes. But before I could do that, the board members called an emergency meeting and accused me of being the thief." Ben walked closer to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about the timing here. Ms. Santos discovers evidence of theft. She prepares to report it to authorities. But before she can make that report, she is suddenly accused of being the thief herself." The prosecutor objected again. "Your Honor, the defense is asking the jury to speculate about timing instead of focusing on evidence." Sustained, Judge Wilson said. "Mr. Rodriguez, please stick to the facts that can be proven." Ben nodded. He had made his point about timing, and he could see that some jury members were thinking about what he had said. Maria, I want you to look at this bank statement from one of the accounts where money was stolen. Do you recognize the authorization code used to transfer the money? Maria examined the document. Yes, that is board member Tom Miller's authorization code. Only he has access to that code. But the prosecution claims you made these transfers. How could you have used Mr. Miller's private authorization code? I could not have used it, Maria said firmly. Each board member has their own unique code that only they know. The company's security system requires these codes for any large money transfers. Ben turned to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the key to understanding this entire case. The prosecution wants you to believe that Ms. Santos stole this money. But the evidence shows that she could not have made these transfers without access to authorization codes that belonged to other people. For the next hour, Ben methodically went through each piece of evidence, showing how the financial transactions could only have been made by board members with access to the special codes. He demonstrated that Maria had been investigating the same transactions that she was now accused of making. The courtroom was completely quiet as people realized what Ben was proving. Maria had not been stealing money. She had been trying to catch the people who were stealing money. Your Honor, Ben said finally, I would like to call Tom Miller to the witness stand. The prosecutor jumped up. Objection. Mr. Miller is not on the witness list. Your Honor, Ben replied, Mr. Miller is present in the courtroom today. His testimony is essential to proving Ms. Santos's innocence. Judge Wilson looked around the courtroom and spotted Tom Miller sitting in the gallery. Miller looked uncomfortable and was whispering urgently to a man beside him who appeared to be his lawyer. Mr. Miller, please come forward, the judge instructed. Miller stood up reluctantly. He was a heavy man in his 60s who had helped found Maria's company in its early days. Ben had seen him in news interviews, always talking about how proud he was of the company's success. Mr. Miller, Ben began when Miller was seated in the witness chair, you are a member of the board of directors of Maria's company, correct? Yes, Miller answered nervously. And you have an authorization code that allows you to approve large financial transactions? Miller's lawyer called out from the gallery. I advise my client not to answer that question. Judge Wilson addressed Miller directly. Mr. Miller, you are not on trial here, but you are required to answer questions truthfully. Do you have an authorization code for company financial transactions? Yes, I do, Miller admitted. Ben showed Miller the same bank statements he had shown Maria. Mr. Miller, do you recognize this authorization code on these transfer documents? Miller looked at the papers and his face went pale. I cannot remember all of my transactions. Mr. Miller, this is your personal authorization code, is it not? Miller looked at his lawyer, who was shaking his head frantically. But Miller was trapped by the evidence and by his oath to tell the truth. It appears to be my code, he said quietly. And these transactions moved money from company accounts to private accounts that Ms. Santos had no access to, correct? I would need to check my records, Miller said, but his voice was getting weaker. Ben walked over to the evidence table again. Your Honor, I have bank records showing that the private accounts receiving this stolen money belong to Mr. Miller and 2 other board members. These men have been stealing from the company for over 2 years, and when Ms. Santos got close to exposing them, they framed her for their crimes. The courtroom erupted in shocked voices. Miller jumped up from the witness chair and tried to leave, but court security officers blocked his path. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, looking confused and embarrassed, the state requests a recess to review this new evidence. Judge Wilson banged his gavel to restore order. The court will recess for 1 hour while I review these documents. During the recess, Ben sat with Maria in a small conference room. She was crying, but these were tears of relief, not sadness. Ben, how did you figure it out? She asked. I learned a long time ago that the truth usually hides in the details, Ben replied. When someone is lying, they cannot control every small piece of evidence. The authorization codes were the detail that Tom Miller could not explain away. When court resumed, the prosecutor stood up with a grim expression. Your Honor, after reviewing the evidence presented by the defense, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Maria Santos. We will be filing new charges against Tom Miller and the other board members involved in this conspiracy. Judge Wilson nodded. Ms. Santos, all charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go. Maria broke down completely, sobbing with relief. Ben put a gentle hand on her shoulder as she tried to compose herself. Outside the courthouse, Maria faced a crowd of reporters who had been waiting to hear the verdict. But she only wanted to talk about one person. Ben Rodriguez saved my life today, she told the cameras. When everyone else abandoned me, including my expensive lawyers, this man stood up for the truth. He proved that justice is not about money or degrees or connections. It is about having the courage to do what is right. Later that evening, Ben and Maria sat on a bench outside the courthouse where Ben had first seen her crying and alone. Ben, I want to pay for you to go to law school, Maria said. You would be an amazing lawyer. Ben smiled and shook his head. Thank you, Maria, but I am 53 years old. Law school is for young people with their whole careers ahead of them. Then let me do something else, Maria insisted. Let me set up a fund to help people who cannot afford lawyers. We could hire real lawyers to help people like I was today, people who have no one to defend them. Ben thought about his daughter Rosa and all the other people he had seen over the years who had faced the legal system without help. I would like that very much, he said. But only if I can help run it. I want to make sure we help the people who need it most. 6 months later, the Santos Legal Aid Foundation opened its doors in a building next to the courthouse. Ben left his job as a janitor to become the foundation's director. Every day, he helped connect poor defendants with good lawyers who would fight for them. Maria visited the foundation every week, often bringing coffee and sandwiches for the staff. She and Ben had become close friends, bonded by their shared experience of fighting for justice against impossible odds. The foundation's first case involved a young single mother who was accused of a crime she did not commit. As Ben watched a volunteer lawyer defend her in the same courthouse where he had defended Maria, he thought about his daughter Rosa. He could not bring Rosa back, but he could make sure that other people would not face injustice alone. Sometimes the most important victories come not from changing the whole world, but from standing up for one person when they need help the most. And sometimes, the person who saves someone else ends up being saved themselves.